what aesthetics is. Aesthetics is the contemplation and the consideration of beauty. So today, I'd like to talk a little bit about Orthodox Christian aesthetics, and I've got the lecture set up in 3 sections. The first section, we're going to talk a little about what some of the features of Orthodox Christian aesthetics are. In the second section, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of Panagiotis Michaelis. He's a Greek scholar, was a Greek scholar, and he wrote in the 40s and 50s, and he wrote a very influential book. Alas, it's out of print. Anyone who owns a press and would like to reprint it, please talk to me, because we really need this book now in the Orthodox Church. But it's called An Aesthetic Approach to Byzantine Art. And he, in that section, I'm going to talk about what are called the 6 aesthetic categories. It's a really interesting way of categorizing and looking at art. It's fascinating. And then the last section, I'm going to talk about practically what this looks like in an Orthodox church. What are the different facets of how beauty looks in an Orthodox church? So, let's begin by talking a little bit about what are some of the features of Orthodox Christian aesthetics, Orthodox Christian beauty. The first and most important feature of beauty in the church is that it must be perceived noetically. Not just intellectually, but through the noetic experience. With the noetic experience, we approach Christ via art, not solely through the mind. The Orthodox Christian approach to beauty is an integrated, holistic way of approaching art. We approach through the nous along with the mind and the senses. It requires a quiet, peaceful, deep approach to the art. Our appreciation of iconography must be reached through prayer. Our appreciation of architecture must be sensed through physical presence in a church. And our appreciation of chant must be sensed through hearing that goes deep into our nous. Our experience of the beautiful as Orthodox Christians is not like walking through a museum. It is an entirely different perception of art, not as a bystander, but as a participant. I had the blessing of being able to arrive in San Francisco yesterday morning, and so I got to walk through the city. I love walking in cities when I'm in a new city. So I always try to get at least, a few miles in of walking around the city. And I ended up being able to go and visit the DeYoung Museum that's here in Golden Gate Park. I was very curious to visit it because the DeYoung has one of the largest non-indigenous collections of American art in the world. And that's art from the 17th to 20th centuries that is done by basically people who immigrated to the US. That's in opposition to, say, Native American art. And I was really curious because now that I'm in this whole field of aesthetics, I'm very much aware of the fact that we are going to need to develop and hone an American Orthodox aesthetic approach if this is going to continue into further generations. So I feel like it's important to sort of see where have we been aesthetically in America. And it was very interesting. It's a great collection, actually, especially the Hudson River School paintings. The collection is beautiful. I believe it's the largest, I think it might be the largest in the world of Hudson River paintings. Beautiful. But I was struck by it being in the museum that it was very noisy and busy and kind of almost had a frantic quality. It was a Saturday. There was a really big Oscar de la Renta perspective going on. And I didn't go to that. But I wasn't that interested in it, actually. I mean, maybe to see the seams and things like that. But I wasn't interested in like the frills and the color and the whole fashion thing. But anyways, and so I'm there, and there's this very sort of party atmosphere going on. And we're in a museum. We're in the presence of art. And it was really and then this morning, then to kind of fast forward, this morning I'm standing in church, and it's an entirely different experience. I'm in the presence of a tremendous amount of art. Oh my word, your church, oh my. That was a blessing to me, believe me. It just fed me down to the very bottom of my nous. It was just wonderful. And to be there and to contrast that experience with being in a museum where people are walking by quickly and they're snapping photos and they're talking and they're chatting and it's very active, but to be in the church where we're taking in all of this art that we're seeing around us into our nous. This is very much how we experience beauty as Orthodox Christians. We experience it noetically. So how does the nous perceive? Through the senses that feed into our mind and then into our nous. It is an entirely integrated process. Just as our eyes do not actually see, but rather receive and transmit sensory information to the brain, so do all of our senses receive and transmit aesthetic experience to the nous. The reasoning mind is being fed by the senses, and it in turn feeds the nous. Otherwise, we're like a person whose eyes function, but they have neurological damage, which prevents their brain from seeing. So unless we have this integrated process of taking it in through our senses and our mind and feeding our nous, it's like we are aesthetically blind. Another feature of beauty in the church is that we utilize the construct of time. Orthodox Christian art, and when I say Orthodox Christian art, just to clarify, I am referring to the big ones: architecture, iconography, chant, vestments, metalwork, wood carving. If it's beautiful and in a church, in an Orthodox church, that's Orthodox Christian art. All of this art is expected to unfold in time, not to be instantly apprehended. In our modern world, with its infatuation of instant gratification, we tend to approach art with an expectation of instant comprehension. I saw this at the DeYoung yesterday. Oh, saw that one. Oh, saw this one. Oh, saw that one. And walking through. This is another unique feature of Orthodox art in that it unfolds rather than appears. It's not an Instagram, but it's like a wedding reception or a musical concert. You can't take a snapshot of Handel's Messiah. Neither can you instantly apprehend Orthodox Christian architecture, iconography, vestments, or music. Now, just as an aside, I've been thinking a lot about this topic for a long time now, and I think that this point about it unfolding in time is of particular note to converts who approach the church from a Western mindset in which everything should be instantly understood intellectually if it's put in the proper words or framed in the correct logical argument. The Eastern mindset is of an entirely different approach, one in which our understanding and our noetic comprehension takes place over time and through mystery. We don't get Orthodox Christian art, but rather we noetically experience Orthodox Christian art through our entire life. It is a journey rather than a destination. This is something that's really changed too. When I became a convert in the early 90s, the only way that you could experience the church was by going to a service, reading rather ponderous books, or knowing an Orthodox Christian and spending time with them and in their home. This was the only way. I mean, I was 23 when I came into the church, and my whole first year of becoming Orthodox, and just to let you know too, I'm like really a convert. I actually came from an entirely unchurched background. My family were all rednecks. We drank beer and built cars on the weekends. We didn't go to church. So, truly. And so, I got my first gun at age 6. So yeah, I'm really bona fide. I could be card-carrying redneck. So anyways, when we were in the church and going through our catechumenate period, I was very blessed. At this point, I was married, and so my husband and I were able to do this together, and I always felt so blessed for that experience, that we were able to convert together, because not everyone has that blessing, and it's a wonderful thing. And he came from a very Protestant background, so he had that very Protestant subculture, and I didn't have anything. I'm like, this is so different. And I remember just one of the things that struck me the most at first was the beauty. It was just so beautiful. And if our churches are beautiful, why would we go anywhere else? We don't have to convince anybody. If it's beautiful, there's really not a lot of convincing to do. If someone's nous is there, and this beauty is what they are craving, and Christ calls them, there's a Russian theologian that says, Christ charms us into the kingdom. I love that saying. And the beauty does this. But nowadays, with the advent of the internet, and again, I'm not like all technology is evil person. I want to just make sure I put that out there, because sometimes when I say something negative about the internet, people assume that I have a website business. I'm really okay with the internet. But what I find is that a lot of the young adult converts that say we have in our parish, they read the internet, and all of their information coming into the church is all through the sense of sight. It's all technology, books, all this. And I'm getting to the point now, my husband's always really like sweet and loving and pastoral with them, and I'm a little bit more of the tough love mother. And I just tell him, put the books down, put the books down. I think there should be a rule. If you want to be an Orthodox Christian, you can't read anything for the first year. Because I think that you need to be in the church. And so this experience of being in the church, when you just read the books and you're just reading the blogs and you're on the internet and all this kind of thing, you're only feeding the sense of sight. And it's almost like like saying to someone, I'm going to work out, but I'm only going to work out my bicep. I'm great. I got a great bicep. I've got this amazing bicep. And the rest of my body is completely unconditioned. We need to fill all the senses, hearing, taste, touch, sight, all of these things. Otherwise, we have this whole imbalance. And I think that's part of what's going on. I think it's something that's and it's frustrating to converts when you tell them that, like, put your books down, just go to church. But what? It's like, yes, you just need to be in that physical space. So that's important. Now, one more feature of Orthodox Christian aesthetics is that historically, the study of aesthetics was akin to the study of God, the beautiful God. The study of theology would have been a subheading under the umbrella of aesthetics. And this was what we inherited from the Greek philosophers. It would have been aesthetics. We study what is beautiful and orderly, and so theology is one of those things that we study underneath that. And now in the modern age, we have it completely inverted. We have theology as the umbrella. We've got to have everything's got to be theologically correct. And so then we have aesthetics is sort of like this little poor cousin that gets to kind of sneak under the umbrella, like if it's really raining really, really hard. And we don't really give a whole lot of, attention to it. But historically, throughout the majority of the history of the church, we studied what was beautiful and orderly and proper. And of course, theology is one of those things. So this is a very important thing to understand, is that we've sort of slipped into this more Western mindset of thinking that everything has to come under theology. And really, it actually has to come under aesthetics. So to wrap up this little first section before I move on to talk about aesthetic categories in more depth, I want to just bring up one last comment, because this always comes up in Q&A, so I thought, I'll just beat you to the punch on this one. So this is the thing I always get asked, and so I finally was like, I just need to put that in the notes. And this one I actually have my husband to thank for, because we were talking it through, and his answer was so good that I was like, I'm just going to have his answer and not try to rewrite this. Because this is the question I get asked. So, it's wonderful that everything's beautiful, and the church is beautiful, and God is beautiful, and everything's beautiful, but how does this work in the fallen world? This is how I always get asked this. And this is my husband's words. The world has been redeemed and is truly inherently beautiful and resurrected. Yet we only see as much as we are able to participate in its resurrection. If the world looks ugly and broken and fallen, it's because we're still living behind the veil, still trapped within the prison of the fleshly mind. But as the grace of the Holy Spirit liberates our minds from the enslavement to the flesh, the nous is able to perceive clearly. I just couldn't rewrite that. And if we think about this, think about the saints, the stories of the saints. We have so many wonderful stories of the saints. And I think we all have that favorite thing that we like to hear that the saints did. And my favorite thing is how everybody gets beautiful. Oh, I love this part. This happens. So-and-so, such and such a saint was older, and as he got older, he looked around and everyone was beautiful. And such a saint, and he was, he got older, and all the people around him were beautiful. I'm like, oh, I am in it. I'm like, oh boy, if I could get to that point in my life where everyone I met I thought was just beautiful. So imagine tomorrow if you walked through the city or the airport or wherever busy place you were, and imagine if we could truly see everyone the way that Christ sees them, with that loving mercy and compassion. It would revolutionize us, and it would revolutionize the world. So the beauty is there. It's a matter of whether we are moving beyond the veil to see it. Now I'd like to move on and talk about the 6 aesthetic categories. This part's really fun. Now sometimes I do this with a slideshow and sometimes I don't. But today I'm not going to do it with the slideshow. So we'll talk about it. Now this is based, as I mentioned, on the work of Panagiotis Michaelis, who wrote An Aesthetic Approach to Byzantine Art. It is a beautiful book. The man definitely takes his own advice. It's beautifully written. I don't even know how he had such fluency in English, but it's just beautiful. The language is beautiful. It's all about art and architecture in the church. and all mostly based on Byzantine art. But there actually, though, there are a number of, I believe there are some Russian buildings that he mentions in there too, some Russian churches and architecture, so it's wonderful. So back in about the 16th century, philosophers started talking about there being categories to aesthetics. Like, we can't just say, oh, that's pretty. We want to talk about why something is beautiful and have categories. They wanted to kind of standardize it. So there are 6 major aesthetic categories, and these are the ones, this is how Michaelis uses them. Different aestheticians will maybe substitute one word for another, that sort of thing, to be a little different translation, but I thought these were really good. So they are the beautiful, the sublime, the graceful, the ugly, the comic, and the tragic. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in just a minute about those. But the general idea, the general theory that Michaelis presents is that historical epochs of art are marked as either beautiful dominant or sublime dominant. Beautiful and the sublime are like the 2 major categories. And then there are these transitional periods that are where things just get all kind of moshy. Like, you got beautiful mixed with a little ugly, or you've got sublime and tragic, or you've got these different things going on where things get kind of like everybody's a little confused. They're getting ready to go into a new historical epoch. So for example, the ancient world, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, was very much beautiful dominant. The natural form, the appreciation of realism, sculpture, these sorts of things. This is the beautiful. They're concerned with order and harmony, and very, very anthropocentric, very man-centered. And then you have a little transition period, and then you move into the Byzantine era, which is about 1,000 years, and it is marked by the sublime. Now the sublime, if we have to put it in one word, would be the heavenly, or the spiritual. But it's a little bit more complex than that, because it even has to do with things like it would be very much sort of cosmos-centric, very much about the universe, as opposed to just man. And so things that are sublime are very concerned with heaven, with the spiritual, and even with the natural world, yes, but more with sort of the power of the natural world. So whereas the beautiful might appreciate a lake or a pond that's quiet and peaceful and at rest, the sublime is going to be about the tsunami that takes out Thailand. So it's a little bit more like that. And those sort of great forces that remind us of how small we are as men. That's a good way of putting it. It really, when you think about it, the beautiful has to do with when we're more sort of man-dominant. Boy, we're men and aren't we great? And the sublime has a little bit more to do with being God-dominant. Wow, there's a God. So we have these categories, okay? But then like these other ones, graceful, ugly, comic, tragic, sort of intermix. So one of the things, I was reading Michaelis, and I was doing the math. I'm like, wait a second. If we just did ancient world, and they were like beautiful, and then we had transition, and then we did beautiful, and I'm thinking of the years and the centuries, and I'm like, wait a second. That means we're in a transitional phase. And I thought that made perfect sense to me, because we are surrounded by a lot in our art and in our architecture right now that you could qualify as ugly, comic, tragic, and we're a real mosh pit right now. And this was so encouraging to me. I was like, yes, glory be to God. When I read this, I was like, glory be to God. It's not all going, hell in a handbasket. It's like, yay, it's getting better. Because we're moving towards, according to Michaelis, and he was writing 50 years ago. And this was how he says it. I thought this was very interesting. He's very unequivocal on this point. He really does agree. He does think we are moving in to a greater, another huge art historical epoch that is going to be marked by either the beautiful or the sublime. And he thinks it might be the sublime. So here's the quote from him. It is only when we come to the 20th century that, after the Italian Renaissance and the Baroque, with their influence in the various countries of Europe, we begin to divine a new large wave of art, of a revolutionary art which gives every promise of being sublime in character. What gods will the powers of this new theocracy of ours model? Science can never take the place of religion, but if we bear in mind that the modern science of nature is not the statically rationalizing empirical science established by the Renaissance, but one in which the dynamic concept of reality and supra-rational element play a primary role, one that makes us increasingly aware of the mystery beyond physical reality, we may reasonably anticipate that it will ultimately help man towards a new contemplative system. As a side note, this is very interesting to note. Now that I've started watching for this, I've definitely seen it. For example, the field of neuroscience right now is a fascinating one. I mean, it is so fascinating to read any sort of book on neuroscience right now, because one of the things I just love, I'm kind of like a neuroscience junkie these days, because one of the things I love is the humility that these authors have. When you read science books from 20 or 30 years ago, it's very, they almost have a very sort of prideful character. But when you start reading neuroscientists and researchers today, they have this whole sort of almost mindset of like, wow, how little we know about the human brain. And they have this almost sort of childlike wonder in their writing. And I'm thinking about people like Kelly McGonigal. She wrote Willpower Instinct and The Upside of Stress. She is a health behavioral psychologist at Stanford. And I'm thinking of some other people that have written in this field. And it's really fascinating to see there's sort of this whole new wave. Oh, and a lot of research, neuroscience research is going on in marriage and family therapy. That's kind of my husband's like pet topic. So he reads in that topic and I read in aesthetics and then we talk about it. And so he's saying the same thing is happening in the marriage and family life. They're finding all new ways to help use what they've learned in neuroscience to draw people closer together, to make healthier marriages, to make healthier families. So we have this idea of mystery starting to come back into our scientific understanding. So it's going to be very curious to see in a number of decades or generations where that leads us. So, and then in terms of the modern culture, I was forcibly struck by this, that we're definitely in a transitional phase, because a number of months ago, someone recommended to me that I should see a film, Seeking a Friend for the End of the World. Now, it is an R-rated film. I would not necessarily recommend it for everyone, and primarily because the movie has, the plot of the movie is that there is an asteroid coming to Earth that is going to kill everyone in 3 weeks. So you can only imagine the bacchanalia that goes on with that. Yeah, enough said about the R rating. So, but it's a fascinating book about two people trying to find love and meaning when they know their lives are ending in 3 weeks. Steve Carell gives a performance that simply had me weeping by the end of it. It was so powerful. I turned to my husband and I said, oh man, Steve Carell's going to stand before the throne of Christ and he's going to say, good job, because it was so beautiful. It was just beautiful. And I thought this was interesting because it was a complete intertwining of the sublime, the asteroid, that sort of cosmic powerful force, and the tragic, like everyone dies. I thought that was very interesting to see this. So we're starting to see echoes of this in all sorts of things in art going on today. And that can be film, that can be music, that can be all sorts of things. So, and these categories do combine in these kind of odd ways, especially in transitional phases. So we'll see things, we'll see sublime mixed with graceful, or we might see graceful mixed with comic, or we might see comic and tragic, or these sorts of things. It just gives us a way to sort of start talking about art, because when you go to a museum and you have sort of 6 categories, it's quite easy to go, oh, you know what, that's showing elements of the beautiful, or that's showing elements of the sublime. So let's look just for a minute at what those different categories, their attributes. So the beautiful. The category of the beautiful is marked by the measured, the ordered, harmony, quiet contemplation, a sense of safety and peace. The ancient example is the Parthenon. That's the classic example of the beautiful in ancient art, is the Parthenon. The modern equivalent would, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Christopher Burkett, but he's a nationally acclaimed nature photographer. He happens to live in Portland. He's a friend of mine. And, and he loves to trade investments for photos, so I'm just set. Oh, it's great. And so anyways, so we've been trading investments for photos for almost 20 years now, and his work is very beautiful. It has that very ancient sense of order and beauty, and it's trees, and everything's very composed. It's very beautiful. Now the sublime, its attributes are uplifting to the divine, powerful, spacious, a sense of diversity within unity, another sense of what's called the massive with the infinitesimal. And that's the idea For example, if you have Hagia Sophia, which is the classic ancient example of the sublime, in Hagia Sophia, there's all the mosaics, all the tessera. A tessera is the little cube that makes up a mosaic. They're little tiny ones. Oh my word, I saw them at the Metropolitan Museum of Art when I was there in December. They're tiny. They have 6 tessera from Hagia Sophia that they believe are from Hagia Sophia. I've never been so tempted to break a case in my life. But there they were, and they're tiny. They're like a quarter, they're like this big. They're teeny tiny. So all of those, in those sense, oftentimes in the sublime, you have something that is infinitesimal, itty bitty, something little teeny tiny and a whole lot of it, because it makes the space look more massive. It's like this amazing counterpoint between the itty bitty and this massive thing. So you have the little tiny tessera and you have Hagia Sophia. It's kind of a classic example. You have an idea of the upswelling of the nous and the contemplation of the universe and the one holy God, and a quality of cosmic and heavenly energy. The sublime pulls you to God. You'll know it immediately. Your church is an excellent example. You feel uplifted to God when you're in that space. Modern, it's a little harder. We don't, again, because we're in a transitional phase, we don't see a lot of this right now. But I would say that Ansel Adams' photography would have very much echoes of the sublime. He has that very Yosemite, and it's like the power and the majesty of the natural world and of what God's created. So I think some of this is found in like things like Ansel Adams' photography. The graceful. Okay, think Downton Abbey. Okay, the graceful is lyrical, open, pleasant, more surface than depth, having a quality of lightness or airiness, charming, evanescent, syncopation, delicate, dainty. Where we don't have a lot of, there's elements of this in ancient Greek and Roman art, definitely, and there's a lot of actually graceful even in Byzantine art, and a lot of it in Russian art. There's almost like a combination of sublime and graceful in Russian art that's really beautiful. In more of a modern expression, this would be things like Edwardian jewelry or American pewter work or things like this. Again, light, dainty, open work, these sorts of things. We tend to, in this age, be very drawn to the graceful. Like if you go to Home Goods and you're shopping, you can find Italian pottery with all the little vine work, and the little things that people want to hang up in their houses, like the little kind of, just little artsy things that they get, or like, the little scroll work and those sorts of things. Those are all very graceful. The quality of the tragic is the mournful, the sorrowful contemplation of an idea or a thing, the bitterness of life. Now, in the ancient world, this was the Greek tragedies. But in the modern world, I think a lot of this could be things like Mozart or Fauré's requiems, and a lot of modern songwriting. That was where I found it. My oldest daughter is a music education major, and the minute we were talking this through, she's like, "Oh, music, you've got to mention music." And I was really struck by that. There's a modern songwriter, Sarah Bareilles. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her. And her song, Manhattan, is just incredibly tragic. It's this very, very tragic ballad. And I think it's very interesting that, again, we see a lot of the tragic in our modern songwriting. Again, we're seeing echoes of this, and we're seeing these are sort of almost the birth pangs before we're going into another big phase. Now the ugly is pretty self-explanatory, but you can think of it as all no's. That's how I think of it, all no's. So this is no harmony, no order. We're talking chaos, unpleasing to the senses, glaring or shocking, bass being low as opposed to high, and a feeling of sort of anything goes. And again, my daughter had this one to contribute. She had to do this horrible orchestra piece. Oh my word, worst 45 minutes of my life that I had to go and support my daughter and sit through this thing. It was horrible. And what did she tell me? It's called conscious dissonance and serial music is what it's called. And the famous one was a piece called Yalem from the 1970s, where all of the musicians just sort of literally for 45 minutes, do their own thing. She was so frustrated by this. I mean, I was sort of sitting there going, excuse me, all those years of piano lessons for this? But, and that was just sort of my mom moment, But there is this idea of all nothings, all no's in the ugly. Modern examples, well, look around. I would say McDonald's architecture, the Sydney Opera House, places like this. Like there's not a sense of order and harmony and beauty in these sorts of experiences. The comic, which is our last one, the comic is levity. Levity, very much surface instead of depth, lacking contrast. These are things that are insubstantial, joking, something fleeting, something that's not experienced through time. The comic very much has kind of that understanding, which I thought was interesting when I made that connection. A cartoon, you read it and it's instant apprehension. A modern sitcom, a pratfall, these sorts of things, they're fast. They happen fast. They don't require the construct of time. Or very rarely. I mean, maybe in a sitcom they'll take a few minutes to set up a joke. But for the most part, the comic is very, very fast. It happens very fast. So you can use these categories to start sort of looking around, and if you can sort of think about things, even as you're driving around or just going about your day-to-day life, when you start using these to sort of analyze, it gives us a language to start talking about things. Because I think one of the reasons we don't talk about beauty in the church is that we don't have a language for it. And we have not had any art education in the American education system for, I think, going on 70 years. There's a fascinating book for any of you who wants to read more on that called The Lost Art of Dress. Okay, don't be confused by the title. It's really, really good. And it's all on the, essentially, the breaking down of home economics programs in the US education system starting in the 19-teens up until their final dissolution in the late 70s. This woman is fabulous. She's like the best kind of OCD. She's a lawyer, and this is her pet topic, and she writes on this. And it was a wonderful, wonderful read. It's not just about it, but it talks a lot about how people in America, because we've had in home economics, it used to be essentially aesthetics training. Girls did not learn just how to make a dress or scramble an egg. They learned artistic principles. They learned how to talk in an educated and cultured manner about art. They used these ideas and these things they were being taught to decorate their homes, dress themselves, dress their children, these sorts of things. And once we took that out of the education system, we suddenly have no language and no method for how to talk about beauty. So I guess I wouldn't be here if you'd all been through a home economics program, because we'd all be like, fine. But here I am. So this is leading in to what I want to finish talking about, and that is, what does beauty look like practically in the Orthodox Church? We have the aesthetic categories, but we need to have a more practical terminology. Now this is kind of a pet project of mine, and it's a work in progress, but what I've been trying to do is create a terminology list that talks about different characteristics of beauty in Orthodox Church, the facets of beauty in an Orthodox Church, and create a language that is specifically Orthodox. So for example, if you read a book on art history, you're going to read about and hear terms like rhythm, contrast, perspective, things like that. I'm trying to create a list for us in the Orthodox Church that's a little bit more specific to how our art is produced and perceived. So I'm going to share a little bit of that list because it's a really good way for me to talk about how, now that we've talked about why we have the beauty and the aesthetic categories, we're going to talk about what actually makes your church beautiful. So the first one is rhythm. Now, rhythm is a sense of movement, feasting and fasting, joyful and penitent. It's a cyclical nature, a lack of monotony, and it's the importance of repetition. We are theologically always moving towards theosis, like what Father mentioned in his homily today. So in this sense, in the church, how do we see this artistically? Well, first off, we have it in the liturgy in spades. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy. We have actinias, we have rhythm. We do things the same way. We have this rhythm. We have points of the liturgy where there are, I don't want to use the word for lack of a better word, points that are, say, a little more casual, the points where you could sit down and it'd be okay. And there's the points where are more formal and you don't sit down. So we have this idea, even within the liturgy, this idea of rhythm. Artistically, and I'm so glad you have this, because a lot of times I have to really lay this out and explain this for most people because they don't have borders in their church. But you have those beautiful borders around all of your icons, and everywhere you look in your church, there are borders. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? All the little repeating designs, the little leaves, all the little designs that are around all the icons and that are on the iconostases. I love that. This is how the churches are in Greece. I love this. It's one of the things I love the most. It's one of the things I think is missing the most in a lot of American churches is that we don't have these borders, because these borders, they visually give that idea of rhythm. It's like a leaf, repeated 30 times. So this is rhythm. Another thing we have is contrast and light. So we have this idea of bright and dark. In fact, as an aside, one of the things that I actually fly around the country to talk about is color and the perception of color and how we use color in the church. I never expected to do that. And color, when I was writing my book, was like this little subheading under the fabrics chapter. And then suddenly I started researching it and it became a 35-page chapter in its own right. I had no idea what a huge topic it was and how there's ancient color perception and modern color perception. And in the Orthodox Church, we're probably the only organization or group of people in the entire world who still retains a perception of color that is in alignment with the majority of the human experience. Modern color perception is incredibly hue-based. It means like, is it green, is it yellow, is it purple, is it pink? We actually perceive color on, is it bright or is it dark? The hue-based system we've only had since the 1600s. Very new, okay? Our system, which is better, we've had for over 5,000 years of human existence. So this is something that we have to be aware of, this idea of bright and dark and contrast. In the Orthodox Church, we use light as a medium. So like when we talk about an artist and what is their medium, do they paint in oils, do they use watercolors, whatever, that's their medium, it's the method, the thing that they make their art with. Light is a medium for us in the Orthodox Church. And I was struck by it last night again in the vigil. Lights are on, lights are off. Sometimes you look at the dome, and your dome here has that, I don't know how the windows are positioned in the back, but you have that almost sort of oceanic quality to the light, that very blue, beautiful quality that falls over your Plaritera icon in the back. It's beautiful. And so the light is not static in any given service. It's always changing and always moving. We use light in a really unique and creative way in the Orthodox Church. We don't just turn on the lights and we're here. Like today, we turn on the lights and we're here. But in the church, start paying attention to the light. Even the light starts giving us this idea of rhythm. Things up, things down, things up, things down. So there's a wonderful quote from a scholar, Liz James. She wrote a very important book called Light and Color in Byzantine Art. And I love this quote. External light, real light, affects the internal structure of a work of art and the way in which light is represented within that work. But the Byzantines also conceived their art, above all their mosaic art, as a painting with light. It was the glittering, sparkling effect of mosaic that was most admired, as was light created by space as well as by color. The 6th century Byzantine historian Procopius wrote of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, "It was singularly full of light and sunshine. You would declare that the place was not lighted by the sun from without, but that the rays are produced within itself. Such an abundance of light is poured into this church." End quote. Color. Color is another thing that we use in the church to great effect. Our churches are colorful. There's so much color. You cannot look around in an Orthodox church and see a neutral anywhere. In fact, that's kind of the goal. When you go to churches in Greece, you don't see it. And this is always, I work with a lot of missions now, especially when they are, say, in warehouse spaces, industrial parks, that sort of a thing. And it's one of the things I hope to continue doing more work in, is how do we make these temporary spaces into churches? How do we do this? How can we use what we have and use what we know, and how can we get creative about making them have this whole idea of this play of light and color, and basically, how can you get blown away by the beauty of an industrial park? Okay, that's my life goal. Let's just blow them away with the industrial park. Because if people driving by, oh, there's a church, and they're oh yeah, let's step in there, and they're just blown away, the way someone would be physically just, that intake of breath when they walk into your church for the first time. If we could do that in every mission, in every industrial park, in every warehouse in America where there is a mission church, our churches would be bursting. So this is something I feel is very important. So color has a lot to do with that. The historic Eastern Christian color palette is one, a lot of you I understand are from a Russian background. Now this is your native land. You guys know what this looks like. It's reds, it's greens, it's yellows, it's very intense, beautiful colors. We don't have a lot of, say, neon orange in the church. We don't have a lot of the garishness of modern colors. The reason being is that synthetic dye stuffs have only been in use for the last 150 years. Okay, did we catch that? 150 years. That's like a blink in human history. For the rest of human history, we've always had natural dye stuffs. And they have a very, very different tenor, a very different palate. They age like wine. And so they change throughout time. Some colors may actually completely change. You know, a number of the tapestries in the Louvre, they think actually a lot of the threads that look yellow now were originally green or blue, that they faded, and that the color schemes were entirely different than what you see today. And it has to do with how the colors have faded over time because of the natural dye stuffs. So we have, of course, our icons. But the other ways we use color, and I was really struck by this in your church, is the patina of metal. Most churches don't have the sort of historic metal pieces like you do, particularly those beautiful metal banners that are right on, they're on the solea. Beautiful, but that sort of glint and that quality of the patina of metal, that's very much a part of our tradition. That sort of color that you really can't find a name for, that kind of greeny gold color, very much a part of our tradition. We like lots of color. When people that aren't Orthodox ask me kind of like, oh, what does everything look like? I'm like, you know what? Our motto is more is more. Yeah, so it's like, we just keep adding, let's keep adding. So we have the idea of, and we have a lot of color going on in one space. So we have the iconography, we have the wood, the warmth of the wood and that tone of wood, and we have the vestments, and we have the metalwork, and we have all of these things going on in the church at the same time with this color. The understanding for us is that we always prefer, as Orthodox Christians, we always prefer polychromy to monochromy. So polychromy is many colored. Monochromy is one colored. This is very true in vestments. I constantly deal with this in vestments. People call me up and they say, oh, I want a gold vestment. And I'm like, okay, do you want gold with white or gold with red? They're like, no, I want a gold vestment. And I'm like, well, do you want it with white or red? No, I want gold. I'm like, oh, do you mean gold on gold? And they're like, yes. And I'm like, you know what? You can get that in America because of the Western influence here in the church in the States, but I don't have a single supplier in Greece that I can buy a gold fabric. When I go to Greece and I talk to my guy, Dimitri, my friend Dimitri, who sells me fabric, and I'm there, I'm like, okay, Dimitri, do you have any golds? He's like, okay, I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you. And he pulls them all out, and I've got gold with white, gold with blue, gold with green, gold with, red, and then I've got, and he's like, okay, which one do you want? I'm like, no gold on golds? He looks at me like, is that a color? He gives me this whole look like, huh? And I'm constantly having to explain this to people that this is why, in Greece, it's very common to see 3-color vestments. It's something that's catching on here in the States. But for us, we're a little suspicious, is that allowed? Is that on the calendar? And I'm like, of course it is. Our rubrics are only bright or dark. So if it looks bright, it's real easy. If it looks bright, it's bright. And if it looks dark, it's dark. And it's really not a whole lot more complicated than that. But everyone wants to make it more complicated. So for example, I have fabrics that are white and gold and green. People are like, what color is that? And I'm like, well, it's a bright set. So if you're in a church that is that the Holy Spirit is the patron of your church, this could be a wonderful thing for you to wear on every Sunday because green is sort of loosely associated with the Holy Spirit, and this would be a way to bring that in on a weekly basis for everyone. We can be much more flexible in this tradition. Our idea of color is very flexible. We do not have this striated Western paint store approach to color. It's very important. Now, layers. Now, like I just said a minute ago, we do more is more in the Orthodox Church. This is the idea of layers. Now again, tell you, I'm not going to lecture anywhere else for the next 10 years where I'm going to have as good of an example as your church. So this is wonderful. Your church is a wonderful example of this. This idea of layering, that each generation leaves its mark and its layer. So you probably have things in this building that go back more than 100 years. Probably? Yes? Yeah. So you have all of these things that are these layers, okay? You have layers from 100 years ago, and layers from 90 years ago, and layers from 80 years ago, and layers from 70 years ago. And these are all the things that are being built up in the church. We do layers. You go into churches in Greece, especially the ones that are from, the 6th century or the 8th century, the 12th century, and you definitely get the concept of layering. You know, like one whole wall will be this because there was an earthquake and then it, went down, it was demolished, and then they built up something else and it doesn't really match everything else going on. And so there's this whole idea. And to Americans, boy, we really like tidy. We're like, yeah, I don't know, that doesn't really look very organized. And so we have to like really kind of nip that in the bud. When we're in the church and we've got these different layers going on, it's okay. It's the way things should be. So lots of layers. One of the next facets is what in the art world is called emphasis, but I think for an Orthodox terminology, the word hierarchy works better. And that is that some things are more important than other things. And which pieces in the church are emphasized over others. Okay, so the idea in an Orthodox church, in any Orthodox church, is that ground zero of an Orthodox church, where everything begins, is the holy table. Everything starts at the holy table and radiates outward. It's kind of the easiest way of thinking about it. Okay, so the holy table should be the most beautiful thing in any church. This is why my heart weeps when I get people who call me and say, well, we just need something cheap for our holy table. And I'm like, excuse me? No, actually, you should be sitting on the floor and not buying chairs before you should do. Everybody sit on the floor. Don't buy your fancy chairs, because I know those chairs are expensive. You could buy a lot of altar cloths for those chairs. And you outfit the holy table beautifully, beautifully. And this is where you start. And then everything radiates outwards. Then we have the iconostasis, and of course, in your church, it's all beautiful all the time, everywhere. But especially in like mission communities or other churches that are having to decide where to put something or not, always starts with the holy table. And then you notice we progress outwards: the holy table, the iconostasis, the chanter stand, the baptismal font, then the epitaphios over the west doors. So this idea is that certain things are more important than other things. And we have this idea not just in a spatial relationship in the church, like say the holy table and everything radiating outwards, but we also have it through the liturgical cycle of the year. So for example, there's a tradition in Greece, in many monasteries, I love this tradition, and they hang epitrachelia, the stole that the priest wears, they hang them everywhere. And they hang, you'll go in and they'll have 6 or 7 epitrachelia hang like Paschal time or feasts, or if it's the monastery's feast day. Oh, a friend of mine sent me photos at St. Anthony's, and they had hung epitrachelia. There's probably 8 or 9 of them across the iconostasis. They take the beautiful epigonatian, the sword, the diamond-shaped piece, and they hang those on icon stands, and they just deck out the church at Pascha time, or the feast day of the monastery or the church. This is a wonderful custom because it shows that this time of year is more joyous and more important for us than another time of year. We have this idea of rhythm. And I do think, just as a side note, I think this is one of the things that we have in the church that I like to think of as sort of our secret weapon. I think a lot of Americans are weary of monotony. We have a lot of homogeneity. Oh boy, I shouldn't try to say that word. We're very homogenous, and we are very monotonous. People go to work 9 to 5, they live for their vacation, and there's not, like, we don't have a lot of people today, like a lot of our young adults coming into our parish is like, oh no, we didn't really do Christmas or Easter as kids or that sort of thing. You show them this idea of emphasis and hierarchy, and that there's like a cycle and that there's a rhythm to life. Oh, they're hooked. They're like, wait, you mean there's times of the year where we're going to be like more focused on our spiritual life, and then we're going to go party? And they love this. They're like, oh, wow, like this is what they've been missing, is this idea that there is a rhythm to life. And their lives feel very flat. They just get up and go to work, get up and go to work, get up and go to work. And we have this in the church, like ready-made. Another facet is substance instead of appearance. In the Orthodox Church, we use real things. We use quality materials. We use the best of the earth because we are working within an achieved reality, not a produced fantasy. This is why our churches, vestments, and other adornments cannot look like bad 1960s epic movies. The saints are truly among us, and we truly inhabit the kingdom of heaven. Liturgy is not a representation of fantasy or a dress rehearsal. It is none of those things. It is being present in the kingdom of heaven at that time and place. Okay? So we got to make it look like it. So we use the physical reality because we are not it was Bishop Callistus Ware that says Christians are true materialists. We value and understand the material world. We are not Manichaeists and we're not anti-materialists. Although I like to call Americans these days, I like to call them anti-materialist consumers. That's my new favorite term. I think that's perfect. Like, it's like they're buying a bunch of stuff that like doesn't last and isn't like, but they want to just buy more of it. So this idea that we have substance is important. What we the quality of what we make our art out of is important. That we use quality wood, that we use quality metalworks, that our iconographers use quality pigments and paints, and that they properly gesso their boards, that we use quality building materials. And I would say for this, when people are like, well, Khouria, that's just really expensive. Yes, it's very expensive. It's very expensive to build beautiful churches and to outfit them properly. It just is. You just can't really get away from that. However, I do know that it's a blessed work. I know this from myself. I feel like I've had a tremendous amount of blessing in my own life just from having the opportunity to beautify churches. It is literally revolutionized my personal life and my family life. I would not be the person I am today if I had not had an opportunity to work and beautify things. And it blesses the people who participate in it. And this is something I've started to watch happening over the last about 5 or 6 years. I started noticing a trend. I'd have someone call me and say, oh, Father's vestments look terrible. I need to replace them. And it would be like some person in the parish. Like, okay, well, how can I help? So we do that. And then maybe a month or a year would go by, and then they call me back. You know what? Now the altar cloth looks terrible. We just can't stand it. We just realized when we see Father there with the vestments, like, it looks really, really, we need to update that. And then they'll do that. And it's like this whole thing. And within a couple of years, they've like re-outfitted things to make them look really, really beautiful. I had one church, actually, in New Mexico, that this happened all within the space of 3 months. They had really inferior quality textiles in their parish. They didn't really know that. And they got their priest a new set of vestments. And in 3 months, they got the priest 2 sets of vestments, a fully dressed altar cloth, altar boy robes, and like everything, the whole shooting match. It was like every week I'd pick up the phone and there was Fred. Hi, it's Fred again. We need this. And I'm like, Fred, okay, great. And so we were like having trouble keeping up with Fred. But, and Fred and his wife, Fred called me later. He's like, you know what? He goes, I'm so blessed by this. He said, I'm so blessed by this. He goes, I didn't know how important this work was. He goes, but I just want to tell you, he was the nicest guy. He says, I just want to tell you, my wife and I, we just feel like we've been so blessed by this. And I said, well, of course, because we say it at the end of every liturgy, sanctify those who love the beauty of thy house. We say this at the end of every liturgy. It's right there, it's a promise. So, now, the proportion is the last one I'm going to talk about, and then we'll open it for Q&A. The last facet of how we do beauty in the church is proportion, or like what I like to call the itsy bitsy and the ginormous. Now this is the idea of the infinitesimal. So this is the idea that I already talked a little bit about the little teeny tiny tessera make the space feel larger. So this is another idea of contrast. We have sort of a mathematical balance. You'd be surprised how much math is in an Orthodox church. I know. You're like, what? Not quite with you. Okay, well, for example, for years, the only textiles I could get were the ones I had to purchase from Western suppliers here in the US. I had no contacts in Greece or Russia. And then eventually I was able to get some contacts in Greece and I started importing Greek brocades. And within about a month, I'm laying out my patterns, because everything that I make is used, we do a method called direct draft, which means I have my entire library of master patterns, but I have to use the measurements of the client and I have to use the actual fabric I'm working on, because no two fabrics are alike. And I have to work with the fabric and the measurements and the master pattern and I draw directly onto the fabric for that person, that fabric. And there's always this kind of tricky thing where you've got to position the cross and the seams and everything's got to be lined up on the motifs, that you don't have crosses going like this, so you have everything kind of neatly lined up. Well, what I started noticing was as soon as I started buying the more historical designs from Greece, they were all on a 6 or 6.5 inch repeat. And there's something about 6 inches that just works with the human form. I still don't know why. I'd love to read an article on it. I've never found anybody who's written on it. But I started noticing suddenly, the minute I put the back cross position, boom, the seam lined up perfectly. The hem was perfect. Like everything was like perfect in these historical designs. So there was something about the size and the proportion. And this is true in the church too, is that what some things are meant to be little small and some things are meant to be much larger. And so even some of our very small things are very beautiful because they draw you in. I mean, think about a little tiny icon and like how much that can kind of draw you in. because it's this beautiful little thing. So we have a lot of little things, we have a lot of big things. So I'll leave you with a quote from Michaelis, and then I have one more comment I'd like to make, but the quote in terms of this idea of the itty-bitty and the ginormous. The impression of the immeasurable is created in nature by the thousands upon thousands of stars in the heavens at night, or in daytime by the innumerable colors of the flowers in the fields, or the fine-grained layers of sand in the desert, or the monochrome snow in winter covering nature like a vast carpet, or finally by the numberless, ever-present ripples on the surface of the sea that a never-silent wind, even in times of calm, brings into play. These almost microscopic units, by comparison, cause the surfaces to expand and grow immeasurably, so that the circle of the horizon recedes ad infinitum, and the dome of heaven that crowns it becomes boundlessly voluminous in proportion. The limitless distance that divides us from the horizon inspires in us a certain degree of fear and the feeling that the space in and around the sky is infinite. In the diminutive dome of the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia, this is a little tiny building next to Ravenna, the church in San Vitale in Ravenna, with its decoration of stars, art achieves the same sort of effect. This idea that we are in the presence of something immeasurably larger than ourselves. And this is the goal of beauty in our churches. I was really struck by this in your church because it made me think about how St. John Maximovich, he was aesthetically formed and filled in his time in Russia and Serbia. And it was his formation that allowed a church like this to be built so that you're able, I just really hope you guys appreciate what you have. I really, really, really do. Because I go to a lot of places, and this is definitely a standout. But this comes about because at St. John's time and place in history, they knew how important this aesthetic tradition was. It was their lifeblood. It was in their blood. They couldn't not do this. And so this is where we need to move forward as Orthodox Christians in America. We need to take hold of our aesthetic tradition, and we need to not be afraid of valuing the beautiful in our churches. This is a very important and very holy work. So I want to thank you for having me, and I would be happy to open it up to Q&A if you'd like. Okay, this is an excellent question. This will probably be the most important question we have today. Is the aesthetic... Okay, the question is, how do we put these principles to work with our children? How do we instill this love of beauty in our children? Okay? First and foremost, by having them in church. That is the preeminent aesthetic experience, noetic aesthetic experience as an Orthodox Christian. So they need to be in church. They need to smell the incense. They need to taste the holy bread. They need to be because children are totally physically integrated. Wow, aren't they? I have a 6-year-old. And she is very physically integrated when she is in church. She's everywhere, and she wants to be all physically. Don't squelch that. I mean, don't tolerate bad behavior, but maybe give them a little space to explore and remember that they are being aesthetically formed as they do this. Okay, so that's the first and foremost one: is have them in church. The second one is give them some basic education. And it doesn't mean you have to have an art degree. I don't have an art degree. But it can be that when, say if you have small children, when you go to the library and you're picking out books, look, is the prose beautiful? Does it sound like something you'd want to read 20 times? Or are you going to be tired of it after the first time because it's poorly written? Look at the illustrations. I'm currently putting together a list of children's books. I'm doing a presentation on beauty another week. It's a weekend women's retreat on women, beauty, and the church in November in Beaverton, Oregon. And I'm currently putting together a list of children's books that I think either teach good principles about aesthetics or are just particularly beautiful. And these are not all Orthodox children's books. These are things that are out there. I highly recommend the work of, I think Barbara Cooney's Miss Rumphius is one of the best treatises on art that I've ever seen. It's just this beautiful thing. I always had all my kids I read that to my kids. So books. Music is another one. We have so much opportunity for music in this day and age. So I would say classical music, folk music, things like this. Let them hear things, develop their sense of hearing So think about it. If it makes it easier for you with children, break it down. Think about their senses, okay? So their sense of taste. Okay, let's cook good meals for our children. Let's have them understand that this is an important sense. Let's give them good things to look at. That means an uncluttered environment. I know that's a hard one, and I don't mean to say that like as a burden. I know the poor young mother's like, what? I know, I don't want to burden you, sweet young mothers. But I would say your home environment is very important, and it's worth giving time and attention to. It's one of the things that came up in my lecture I gave a couple of weeks ago on this was the importance of like the living room or the space in the house that's the grown-up space that's beautiful and that the children have to know how to behave appropriately in. We've lost this in America, partly due to like the way our houses or our architecture is done. A lot of houses aren't even built with a formal living room anymore, but it doesn't have to be a living room. It can be like a chair and a table and like maybe a beautiful rug or something, a vase, but something that's a little bit of a challenge for them. So like in my living room, I have a little table and I have 3 glass vases on it. They're not particularly expensive, but they are glass. And my 6-year-old, who is very rambunctious, has to know that when she's in the living room, she has to be careful of that table and those vases. So you have this idea of beauty and self-control kind of interwoven. And we used to know how to do this instinctively with children, but I think we need to kind of reclaim that there's a beautiful space in our house. Again, does not mean you need to go out and buy a new house with a fancy formal living room. We need to learn how to adapt American architecture for this. Another one is just pointing out beauty to children. I think one of the greatest things that we can offer today that's quite easy and accessible in our modern lifestyle is nature. It doesn't turn us into deists. It just makes us better Orthodox Christians, okay? So, and this is even from my own experience. I mean, like I said, I grew up with the rednecks, but my dad owned a very primitive cabin out in the foothills of Mount St. Helens. And we had a propane generator and a wood stove and no TV, no radio, no phone. And when I was a kid, we spent most weekends, Christmas break and summers there. My dad loved it up there. And so I had hundreds of hours in the woods with nothing to do. It's part of why I'm a textile person, because in the winter, when it's really rainy in the Pacific Northwest, you stay indoors. And in a cabin where there's no TV and no radio, well, you got to do something. So this sort of exposure to nature can be completely life-changing for children, and it can keep them. I think it's a really good sort of meeting point between sort of their modern society, because in today's world in America, everyone's going to be supportive of giving your kids nature. Oh yeah, that's great. Take them for a hike. Take them to the park. This is all really, really good. And we completely support it from an Orthodox angle too. They're both really good. They're really good. So I would say a lot of nature. Let's see. Letting them move around the church. My daughter Georgia has really taught me this. I just cannot clamp her down too tight in church, or she's just obviously not having a full experience of the liturgy. She has to be able to move. She's highly kinesthetic. And so I've learned that I have to, I had to go to our choir director and say, I'm really sorry, because I know it irritates our choir director when my little one is like moving all over the place. And so we had to kind of find this happy balance. Like, okay, can she move over here? Yes, over here is fine and not distracting. And I totally appreciate where my choir director is coming from. Nobody wants, a 5-year-old running around and distracting the choir. But we kind of had to work out these areas and kind of these zones. And the other thing I would do too with Georgia is I would take a walk. Take a church walk. They do this in Greece a lot. So if a little kid's in church in Greece, and the services are really long, they take the kids and they take them outside, because it's usually nice enough you can. I can't really do that a lot in Portland. But instead what I would do is I would look at her, and so maybe we come for orthros, and then she'd be getting restless, and it'd be like maybe just starting into liturgy. I'd say, hey, how about we take a walk? And so we go and visit all the icons, and we just kind of walk around the church and talk about what we saw. And that can be really valuable. Verbalize beauty for your children. Ask them, even at the dinner table, what did you see today that was beautiful? Start talking about beauty with them. Oh, I think this is beautiful, but do you think this is beautiful? Why do we think this is beautiful? Or I like this color, or oh, do you like this color? Or what colors do you like? Talk about what they're seeing visually and what they're experiencing aesthetically. And children are very aesthetically aware. My 6-year-old Georgia said to me the other day, we had some piece of music on or something. She just looked at me, she goes, that is inspiring. It cracked me up. But I was like, their nous is very open. Their nous they're very noetically open. Let's feed that with a lot of good stuff. Does that help answer the question? Okay. Any others? Yes? I actually think that if we had, okay, so I was at the DeYoung, and one of the things that really struck me was the entire arts and crafts period. Now, I love the arts and crafts period. We're talking about William Morris, the Pre-Raphaelites, Gustav Stickley, this whole period. We think almost sort of very blocky furniture, this sort of thing. But if you start looking at their metalwork, it looks almost pure, straight up Byzantine. I was really struck by that. I saw this hammered bowl, and I'm like, oh, that looks exactly like the 6th century chalice I saw in the Benaki last year. It's really, there's a lot of counterpoint there. So I think, I mean, again, I'm not an expert, but I think that moving forward in America, we need to look and see where are the points in our own aesthetic tradition that we can sort of embrace and adapt sort of the Byzantine and the Russian, the very historical art forms. And I would say Art Nouveau and Art Deco tried to do that. They were really trying to do that. You know, a lot of Art Deco is very Byzantine influenced, extremely. You've got acanthus sleeves, and Egyptian influence too, that whole Mediterranean world. But arts and crafts particularly strikes me as an aesthetic style, if you would, that could work very well. I do see Americans drawn very much towards the early Byzantine style, the more simple lines. This sort of appeals to us. We're a little simple. We're also a very new country. You know, we don't have a lot of layers built up, you know, in just our timeline here in the US. And so I think that I would love to start seeing one of the areas that I think we have tremendous opportunity in the US is in woodworking in general. I think that it would be wonderful if we could get some people who we could actually build things along or orthodox aesthetic lines, but we say, like, for lack of a better word, an American twist, if you would. And I think that twist is going to be involving a lot of, say, the mission style, a little heavier, a little more simple lines, but it's very solid. It has a very arts and craftsmanship has a real solidity to it that you find in early Byzantine art. Like when you look at, say, the dressers that have those little like pieces that go across them, I'm instantly reminded of like door lintels in Byzantium. Like I see things like this that like have kind of echoes of each other. I think that one of the areas we need the most in the US is actually woodworking. It is extremely expensive to import things from Greece, and Greece is much farther along in their timeline, and their style, it's all, you know, fashionable in the church, and trust me, there are fashions even within church architecture investments and things like that. I've seen enough in 20 years to accept that. Their style is very sort of rococo and very intricate and overlaid, and that just doesn't speak to most Americans. Most Americans are like, huh? And, you know, we don't live in Italy and France, and we don't have that sort of whole European culture that is sort of the backdrop for that. So here, we do have to formulate some new styles, but this has been done. This is, I mean, this has been done repeatedly in the church. This is not, we're not creating something totally new. I don't say that we create something new. We need to build on the foundation we've been given. But I do think we have some unique things to bring to it. I would love to see more metalworking too. There's nobody doing metalwork in the US, and there's such an opportunity. We could be doing beautiful candelabras in our churches. And by those, I mean like just all sorts of different candelabras, standing ones. What if you could buy candle bins that were actually American made? And that were, say, I have a guy in Portland that he just messes around with it, but he made me this beautiful ICXC Nika monogrammed garden stake. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like a garden stake? Like, this is too nice for my garden. So I put it in the pot that sits next to my UPS packages to like watch over my UPS packages. But it's beautiful, and it's steel. It's steel. And it really has that very ancient, almost Roman feel. And I think that sort of, and we've already done this in the US. We've done it in the Federal period and in the Gothic Revival period. We have been flirting with the classical world from the very beginning of our country's founding. Okay, and here's another example, if this is interesting. Is this kind of what you were asking? Okay, so here's another example that I came across that just blew my mind. It was so cool. So when I got my start, I started sewing when I was 4, but I started getting really interested in embroidery and real hardcore textile nerd when I was about 18, 19. And one of the first areas that I got into was an area of embroidery called Deerfield work. And it was essentially 2 sisters in Deerfield, Massachusetts in the early 19-teens. And they wanted to go back and reproduce early American embroidery work from the 1700s, from when America was first founded. It's a very distinctive style. It's really beautiful. A lot of open space and these unusual serrated carnations and things like that. And so they did this, and they did it with all natural vegetable silk dyes. They hand wove linen. They showed it, I think, the 1910 World Fair, and they were just a smash hit. And Deerfield work was sold. Deerfield blue and white needlework was sold for many years after that. And all the patterns are now housed at the Deerfield, Massachusetts Museum. So so there's been a lot of written in the embroidery world about this. So I became just obsessed with Deerfield work. And so I did Deerfield work for a number of years, just as a hobby. I love to embroider, so I always have something going. And so I was doing this. Okay, so they have these very, very distinctive, stylized little serrated carnations. They look like this little flower. They almost look sort of like a flower that's had little bits taken out of it. And you'll even see the same sort of serrated carnation thing in some of the arts and crafts work. The sort of stylized lilies and carnations and things is very similar to that. So I'm in Greece about 4 or 5 years ago, and I'm at my friend's shop in Thessaloniki, and I'm buying new embroidery designs because I'm there on a buying trip. And I'm like, okay, show me. And I'm looking at, yet another ICX Unica, yet another cross, yet another spray of roses. These are all good. He pulls his fabric and sets it right in front of me, and I just simply stand there and gasp. I'm like, it's Deerfield work. I'm sitting there looking at the exact same. I'm like, I know how to make that. I know this. And I was so startled. Well, it turns out what happened is that serrated carnation style started in Persia and had a parallel artistic development. From Persia, it went to India, and they started making chintzes. And from India, the chintzes went into England, and the English loved their chintzes. Well, when America was founded, we couldn't import them because of all the tariffs. Nobody would let us have the fancy fabrics. So we had to make our own fancy fabrics. And so what did the American needlewomen do? They made these Deerfield designs based on these English chintzes. And in a parallel development, the design went from Persia into Byzantium and into Greece. So this one design is actually fully Orthodox and fully American. And I think part of it is we just don't know how to look for these counterpoints. They're there, but we don't know how to look for them. So this is another reason why I want to start talking about this. Do I want a solely American style? No, God forbid. I don't want that. I want to build generationally. I want us to be the next layer, and we need to be very careful about that, how we do that artistically. But there are so many touch points, we're just not looking. Does that help? Was that the question you had? Okay, great. Hope that answered that. Sorry. You get me on Deerfield work, and I'm just lose my head. Okay. Sorry. I'm really, really a big embroidery nerd. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You want me to get on a soapbox? Oh, people, that is my soapbox. Handwork. Do you know now they're doing studies, and they actually think that the reason the Japanese students are so good at math and science is because every year in the Japanese educational system from 5-year-olds to high school, so every year they have a required handwork course they have to take every year. And there's a lot of understanding there's a lot more, big field of neuroscience, is understanding more about neural network wiring, okay? And people who do handwork, it's like learning languages, okay? So the old saying, what is the thing they say? If you haven't learned a language by the time you're 8, your brain sloughs off, your brain lets that wiring go. Well, the same is true with handwork. I've gotten to the point now where I will not engage a new sewing apprentice who, if she has learned sewing after the age of 25. I'm like the monastery. You learned after 25, I don't want to see you. So, I love you, but I don't want to see you. Because I've learned that there is something very fundamental about learning that in age. So, does this mean you need to get your kid a sewing machine? Not necessarily, although some boys, a sewing machine is a power tool, people. Power tool, okay? Thank you. It's just the girl power tool, okay? I just am like, seriously, have you ever I had to rewire my industrial sewing machine, okay? If that wasn't a guy thing, I'll tell you, I'm sitting there with all the wires and trying to rewire it. We definitely need to get kids handwork. Now, those of you who have a Russian background, I would highly recommend your Russian cross-stitch designs. Oh, come on, they're all over Pinterest. I slobber over them. They're beautiful. So you got plenty of those, and you can literally learn how to cross-stitch in 12 minutes. There's this lovely lady on the internet. I can't remember her name, but she's British, and she just walks you through how to cross-stitch, and it's really sweet. So 12 minutes, and you can be, and 12 minutes and $10, and you can be helping your kids learn how to cross-stitch. We do this at camp now. My husband and I are the directors of Camp St. Mary of Egypt, up in Spokane, Washington. And about 3 or 4 years ago, we make up 400 friendship bracelet packs every year at camp. We hand them out, and what do you know? Everybody's listening better during all the education sessions. This sort of thing going on here, for many, many, many people, helps this go on up here. I know for myself, if I'm sitting listening, I have to have something. I've just got a complete disconnect. If I don't have something going on with my hands, I can't hear you. So, I mean, it's just, yeah, so this is part of why I embroider, but this is really, really good for children. It also, in our very sort of modern, fast-paced, more stressful living, any sort of handwork that you do, it's been shown, reduces your vital statistics 10%. So the minute you sit down and pick up a crochet hook or a needle or whatever it is you're going to do, your blood pressure drops, your heart rate drops, your pulse drops 10%. You get calmer. I'm actually working with a young woman that I met in Costa Mesa, and she is a counselor, and she works with girls with eating disorders, and with severe eating disorders, anorexia and bulimia. And we are talking about putting together handwork seminars for them to learn as a way of having something to do when they're getting in that very, very negative thought zone regarding all of their eating. Handwork can be very salvific. I know, I'm going to totally sound like I know, I'm like a guru, but it's so important. We have to teach our children this. And it can be all sorts of things, a little wood burning kit. I mean, there's so much on the internet now. I mean, I know a number of seamstresses who have taught themselves to sew on the internet. And I'm like, whoa. I mean, it's amazing. Even me, we don't use zippers because zippers aren't a historical thing, so I'm really, really not good at zippers. It's like when my girls want me to make them skirts or whatever, I'm like, oh, does that have a zipper? And so finally I was like, okay, I gotta get over this, like my own, lack of knowledge. And so I went on the internet, 7 minutes, I watched this lady, I'm like, oh man, I just nailed my zipper technique. So there's so much out there. This is one of the ways that technology can be really good for us. But we need to revive these handcrafts. And in Orthodoxy, in Russian tradition, Greek tradition, Romanian tradition, all of the Orthodox ethnic traditions have some kind of handwork. Yeah, it's very important. It's very, very important. I cannot really stress that strongly enough. We need to get handwork into our kids' hands for their sanity. They need things like this to do in when the world gets crazy and fast-paced. They need this. Okay, landscape design, very important. Okay, nobody's talking about that right now. Oh, whoa, wait. Okay, hang on. Henry Maguire. Henry Maguire is a Byzantinist, very well respected. He taught at the University of Illinois in Chicago, Urbana-Champaign. His wife is it Eleanor? She has an E name. It's Elaine or Eleanor. She personally owns a collection of Byzantine art, so I don't know what her story is, but I'd like to meet her. I don't know anybody who personally owns a collection of Byzantine art. He wrote a book on Byzantine, it's either Byzantine court garden culture. Somebody just gave me the reference to this book, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. Have you seen the book? Okay, that would be a great place to start. Maguire is an excellent scholar. But yes, okay, so I'm in Greece every year or two. And so the last time I was there, I took all my kids and we visited friends. It was my kids' first time there. And a friend of mine has connections to the Surati monastery outside of Thessaloniki. So we went. And one of the things I was very struck by was how beautiful their landscaping was. And their Catholicon, their church, is fairly new. And they had really it's where St. Paisios is buried. Okay, so that's the monastery I'm talking about. And it's so beautiful. Yes, they use all these sort of geometric designs and they use little stones. And honestly, given what you can buy at Home Depot and Lowe's, this would not be expensive. I mean, we're not talking grand stucco, huge projects. You could probably do a lot of this with just some of those amazing little stones you buy at Home Depot or Lowe's. But they do these really cool things where they make little diamond shapes. They'll take a bed that's a rectangular bed, and then they'll put other designs in it, and then they'll plant the plants accordingly. So it's not particularly sophisticated, but it's very beautiful. And then I was struck by it too in the, somebody sent me a link, and you guys probably know about this better than I do. There's that church in Russia, and I cannot remember if it's in Moscow or St. Petersburg, but the one where all the people came together, 80,000 people came and built it, and the people took their jewelry and hammered it into mosaics. It was so inspiring to read about them. And if you look at their pictures, notice how much attention they gave to the landscaping. Yes, we need to have that harmony between the church and the landscape? Very much. Of course we do. And we have this idea of bringing the natural world into the church. So I have a funny story about that. So I was thinking about this whole concept of bringing in the natural world, and we do this in many ways. Like we have flowers carved into our iconostases, we have flowers on our vestments, we have sheaves of wheat. We bring the natural world in. And when I was in Greece, again, one of my trips, I just was like, they have so many flowers, like the women bring flowers into the church. And at that point in time, no one in my parish did that except for on Good Friday. So we have this woman in our parish who's just so delightful, Nectaria. And Nectaria came to a little women's gathering at my house, and I was just mentioning this in passing. I was like, flowers, it's like something you can do. If it's a birthday or celebration or whatever, you could like bring flowers to church. Like this is an easy thing. It's another thing you can do with children. You can bring flowers. You can have them pick out something, and they can bring it into the church and like as an offering. Gives them an idea of bringing, offering beauty to the church. Well, Nectaria like totally took me at face value, and we have had no less than 4 to 6 vases of beautifully arranged flowers every Sunday since for the last 2 years. It's amazing. There's like a floral explosion in my church. And it was funny, one of the older ladies was sort of like, she's spending a lot of money on that. And of course, bless her heart, like I think she's spending her own money. I don't even know where the money's coming from. But she does these beautiful arrangements, and she had never done floral design of any sort before. She went on YouTube and learned how to do floral design, and she's been teaching herself, and it's been this amazing charism. Do you know this word? This gift that she has is to do these floral arrangements. I mean, I cannot wait for Pascha. I'm like, I can't wait to see what she does. It's just beautiful. And now she's very concerned about I want to make sure the vases are like aesthetically pleasing along with the flowers. I mean, she really gives us, she's very, very bright. And she gives us a lot of time and attention. And so one of the ladies was kind of like, that's a lot. And she told me, she says, this is so important to me. She says, I feel like this is important to my soul. And I loved that she felt that bringing this beauty into the church. And she sort of just struck out. She just sort of like, I don't know how to put a flower in a vase, but I'm just going to kind of go on faith and do it. And we have this beauty in our church that I have no experience. I have no ability to arrange flowers. I can sew and things like that, but I can't do flowers. And she can. So I feel like there's certain people that are really drawn to that, to the natural world and landscaping. We absolutely. In fact, what I would like to see in America, okay, if I can really dream big here for a moment, what I'd really like to see, okay, when you build a church, you have to have a structural engineer, and you have to have a sound engineer, and you have to have the engineer, and the contractor. Okay, what I think we should do in churches, we should have landscape engineers, landscape designers that are particularly educated in church, like designs that work well for churches. And I think then we also need to have textile engineers, people like me who come in, because I cannot believe how many churches are being built in America, and I see pictures of these beautiful churches, and they have either almost no textiles, which is something you never see in Greece, and I bet you don't see it in Russia either. Or they have this beautiful, amazing, obviously $100,000 iconostasis from Greece, because I know what these things cost, because I know the guys who sell them. And yet there is just the worst quality, cheapest $12 a yard brocade on everything. And I'm like, it's so much of a disconnect. So I'd like to see, yes, so I think that bringing in all the artisans into the church when we build a church would be very important. Yeah, but landscape designers would definitely place for that in the church. Because if you think about it, it's one of the layers that you go through to go into the church. We can make that a holy experience. Yes. Okay, so basically, the general rule of thumb is that we do have to dry clean now. Well, there's 2 schools of thought. I should back up. There's 2 schools of thought. I have some of my older clients, who will buy vestments and wear them until they can no longer be worn, and then they will burn them. They will never have them cleaned. That's a more monastic approach. In my experience, I've had good success working with dry cleaners as long as I go in and I make it relational. Hi, I'm Krista, and I have the same, and this is a very important, special thing to us. We use it in our services. Will you please handle it with reverence and care? I've never yet had a dry cleaner who will not work with me. But most vestments that you're going to see in the US, with few exceptions, most vestments are dry clean only. But one of the most important things is routine cleaning and then folding when out of season. I used to tell everyone to fold everything all the time, and my husband really got after me. He's like, because I can't finish liturgy and fold my vestments and get to coffee hour and talk to everybody who needs to talk to me. He's like, you can't tell them to do that. So now I revise it and I say hang on broad hangers, the ones that suit coats come on. Hang on hangers in the season, in that current color season that you're using them, and then whenever possible, fold. Folding just gives, and then the other thing too is rotation. But we already naturally do it in a church, and a place here like the Cathedral where you're going to have lots of vestments. Rotation is really important. So this is one of the things, rotating fabrics allows them to rest. They need a little rest after they've served, just like all of us. They need to serve and then they need to rest. And so with my seminarians, for example, I always recommend that they get a bright set and a dark set. And I usually tell them don't buy purple, buy burgundy, because burgundy can be used far more often throughout the liturgical year than purple. Purple in the US, and it's only in the US, is reserved for Lent. Just so we're all aware, that practice is not used anywhere else in the Orthodox world. In Greece, they use either purple or burgundy or black in Lent, and I've even seen purple vestments in Greece used outside of Lent. So it's just considered a dark color there. So that's very important, is that you rotate sets of vestments. Because if you wear something over, well, imagine if you were a man and you were going to work and you had a business suit and you wore it every single day for 3 years, what's going to happen? It's going to fall apart. Mm-hmm. Same thing with vestments. They're just sort of like clothes on steroids. And then do be careful of anything that's hand embroidered. Anything hand embroidered has actual real metal in it. Like I import custom embroidered metal pieces from India. I work with a family firm there. And so they'll do embroidered icons. These sorts of things, you really only want to have them cleaned if you absolutely have to. And a lot of those things like epignatia and chalice veils, they don't really need a lot of routine cleaning. Altar cloths need very little cleaning. Altar cloths, a good little, if they're velvet, use a velvet brush. They really only, those, as long as they're sort of shaken out and hung up in the off season, they'll be fine. Altar cloths can go 50, 60 years. I mean, I've seen some altar cloths that are even older than that. And I've worked on epitaphy. I've just sort of a smattering of conservation experience. I did a conservation workshop in Greece a number of years ago. And so I can do a little bit of preventative conserving of epitaphy, the Holy Friday embroidered icon. And those, the biggest thing with those is dust. Dust is actually what kills fabric. Dust, if you think about dust is little tiny rocks, and they act like knives on fabric, like. So you want to keep fabrics as dust-free as possible. So like if you have an epitafios, every year you want to at least lightly vacuum it. They make these really cool little vacuum attachments for computer keyboards. For computers, they have all these little tools and things. Those are great for vacuuming really important liturgical textiles. Yeah, in general, yeah. And then be reasonable about your wear expectations. This is something that I'm coming up against a lot, more with my newer ordinands, but they think if they buy one custom tailored cassock, they can wear it every day for 6 years and it'll last. And I'm like, well, you couldn't do that with a suit or a jacket or any piece of clothing, and neither can you do with a cassock. I mean, you need to have multiples of something if that's all you're gonna wear every day, all day. So this is something we're actually getting ready to put on the website, is basically essentially kind of a cost per, or how many wears can you get out of a particular garment, to try and estimate it for people, to kind of break this down. Because that's the one thing I've seen in America, because it's called our throwaway clothing culture. There's a great book written on this called Overdressed, The Shockingly High Cost of Fast Fashion. And that's a good book. And she's no Michael Pollan, but it's a good book. And it talks about this, that basically we've basically generationally lost the ability to care for our clothes, because we don't have clothes that are designed to last more than 18 months, a couple of years at max. So yeah, so it's just a little of an intention and learning a few basic things. It's not really that complicated. Yeah, and a good vacuum cleaner. Yeah. A lint brush. Oh, I'm really into lint brushes. Really love lint brushes. Lint brushes are fantastic. They remove all that dust. And you can get the old little red plush ones from Amazon for $4. And then if you have any wool items, I highly recommend what we tailors use, and that's called a brass bristle lint brush. Also available on Amazon for, I believe, $12. Those are really good. Mm-hmm. A lot of people who this has been their form of worship, where there is no beauty, integral to the worship, their noose has become incredibly dulled, like aesthetically dulled, because it's not being fed at all. It's like a muscle that's atrophied. Their noose is very atrophied. So some people are willing. It takes a little work. And I think the most important thing we need to do is we need to not apologize for the work. We need to not try and make it easier or dumb it down for them. We need to not pre-chew orthodoxy. Okay? Well, really, don't we see this happening? Yeah. I see this happening a lot. If you just do this, if you just do this. You know what? Yeah, it's going to be hard. For some people, it's going to be hard. And I would say in those situations, one thing I would say though, is like if they had little kids, I'd be like, you know what, okay, there's this going on, why don't you just come for 20 minutes, Why don't you come at the end? Let them come late. I mean, hey, everybody else does. Let them come late. And so we might as well let the visitors come late, at least in my church. And so let them come late and let them be there and just get a taste. You know what I mean? If for example, if you've got a muscle that's atrophied, and you go out and try, and say you've got a calf muscle that's atrophied, and you go out for a 3-mile walk, you're gonna die. You're just gonna die. You're gonna be so uncomfortable. But if you just take a few steps each day, you're gonna build that up. So I would say, especially for people who are not like instinctively drawn, I mean, some converts, they come in like, oh yeah, just more, I want more beauty. But the ones who are like, whoa, that was a little weird, then little doses is what I would say. Small doses. And just the bits that they can handle. And then just sort of like, oh, you know what? Yeah, this is us. We're big, we're beautiful, we're more is more. Like, this is just what we do. And don't apologize for it.